Hello, everybody. My name is Mia Tata, and I'm a staff member at the People's Forum, which is a political, education, and cultural center for working class internationalist movement building. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the third session of Histories of a Working Class in North America. This is an ongoing series at TPF, which puts researchers and scholars into conversation with organizers and students engaged in working class anti-racist struggles. The histories of US radical labor struggles are often omitted from our traditional education, and we hope that illuminating these stories will help us further develop our organizing and strategies for liberation. In today's discussion, Dockworker Power, Race, and Internationalism, we will be hearing from Peter Cole on the internationalist labor organizing of dockworkers in San Francisco, California, and Durban, South Africa. As somebody who grew up in San Francisco, I selfishly carry deep pride in the radical history of dockworker and longshoreman organizing, and I'm excited to hear about the sharp anti-racist and internationalist analysis of these workers and the networks of solidarity and communication that reach beyond national borders. Peter Cole is a professor of history and a researcher in the Society, Work, and Development Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Prior to tonight's discussion, a cohort of organizers read excerpts from Peter Cole's book, Dockworker Power, Race, and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area, and developed questions for Peter based on the text. We will also be opening up questions to participants here if there's time. So if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function. And if you're on YouTube, you can use the live chat. And with that, thank you so much, Peter, for being here, and I can pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Mia, and thanks to everyone at the People's Forum for inviting me to sort of participate in one of your series on working class history, which naturally I believe in greatly as a historian of US history, but really I call myself a labor historian. And well, you don't meet many people who claim to be such a thing. And so it's an honor to be with you and to those who are choosing to spend some of their free time to listen to a presentation. And I'm excited to have a discussion and answer any questions if there are any afterwards. I'm going to share my screen so that you can look at something more interesting than me. And Mia, does that look okay? Great. Well, again, thank you to the People's Forum and to those in attendance this evening. I was very happy to have written a book called Dockworker Power, as Mia mentioned, the name of the book, which is a comparative history of Durban and San Francisco, two ports that actually in recent times seem a little more logically connected than might on first glance. And when we get to the end part of the presentation, when I talk about dock workers engaging in solidarity actions in sympathy with a free Palestine, Durban and San Francisco, or really more precisely Oakland, have been sites where we've seen activism just in the last month, right, or two. And so sometimes history and the present collide in ways that make it seem even more relevant. For me, history is always relevant, but for a lot of people, it's like, well, what's past is past. Hopefully you'll appreciate the connections. I always say that the reason things are the way they are is because of the way things were, right? And so if you're interested in the present, I believe, not surprisingly, that you should care about the past also. So I wrote this book, Dockworker Power, and came out in very end of 2018, early 2019. Like I said, it's a comparative history. And I'm going to talk some about some of the themes of my book, but spend the largest period of time on the third of those themes, right? But before doing so, like any good historian, we have to go back before even the start of the book in order to sort of lay the groundwork to provide the necessary context. But the subjects that were interesting to me personally, and since I wrote the book, I got to decide what it was about, right? Like, is really first and foremost how workers, as workers, especially through workplace organizations. That sometimes means unions, but sometimes it's not unions. Sometimes it's other sorts of institutions, fight for equality, right? In other words, for not just unions as how they can help their own members, maybe earn more money, maybe have a safer workplace. That's important. But also how workers could leverage their power for causes beyond their workplaces, right? Which we often associate with social movements, right? I personally consider a union a social movement, but a sort of, not the only sort, right? But a lot of us think about social movements like the civil rights movement, right? And sort of neglect that the labor movement, in fact, historically and today, despite its weakness, is in fact the largest organized group of non-elite people in the United States and in most countries where they exist. I did devote a large part of my book to the issue of technological change, which in the shipping industry and more broadly the transportation industry in the 1960s and into the 70s was called containerization, the transformation of literally how we move cargo around the world. And I'll not talk about that this evening because it's sort of, although deeply important, is essentially not what I was asked to speak about. But I'm happy in the conversation at the end if anyone wants to sort of bring that in. Technological change in all sorts of work is very much a reality. And so therefore important, right? Like it literally shapes how we work, but it also shapes our world in ways good and bad and big and small. The third theme of my book really is the one I was asked to sort of speak about primarily, which is how workers in country one might use their workplace power in country two, right? In other words, across national borders, right? A term we sometimes use, transnational, which is not the most pleasant or elegant term and not a term that's household, obviously, but across nations as opposed to within a nation, right? And so really themes 1 and 3 are how workers can use their power, right, on behalf of whether it's racial equality or liberation, in their own countries and cities, but also beyond, right? Like, and that third one's a bit more abstract, right? Because it does beg the question: how can I know something's going on in Myanmar? Can I do something to help? I don't know. That's an important question, and so that's one of the issues, right? We're sort of thinking about, where I hope to help us think about this evening. So my specific book compares 2 cities, one in what now is often called the global south, Durban, in the southern hemisphere, and one in what's called the global north, right, the northern hemisphere, San Francisco Bay Area, right? Why would someone choose to study these 2 places, these 2 countries? The answer, in case you're unaware, is that actually there's a long history, both connecting the peoples of these 2 places, but also of people who think about these places, scholars and others and activists, thinking about them in tandem, right? Comparing and contrasting, right? So in 1966, US Senator Robert Kennedy, who was actually from the state of New York, right? He represented New York in the US Senate in the 60s after his brother was killed and he ran for Senate, right? He visited South Africa briefly in 1966. Great documentary about that. During one of his speeches in Cape Town, he said the following: "I came here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century and then taken over by the British. New Amsterdam became New York, right? Cape Town remained the city of Cape Town. And at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier. A land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology. A land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America." Now, so he's an American talking about America, but talking in South Africa to a South African audience. And unbeknownst to some of you, perhaps, that summary of events in history also accurately describes South African history, right? In other words, we share much in common. Because to do comparisons, you really have to have enough in common in order to sort of make a comparison meaningful. If not, it's irrelevant, right? And so we're not going to compare ancient Egypt to modern America because although humans are humans, well, there's significant differences in our societies, right? Like a little less so, actually, between South Africa and the United States. I'll tell you a little about these 2 places. In the early 1800s, England colonized the eastern side of South Africa, which is the southern tip of the continent of Africa. And that big red arrow helps us see where Durban is located, right? It's actually a very small port physically, even though it's a very large port in terms of the amount of cargo it handles. And in fact, is one of the busiest ports in the Southern Hemisphere today, and has been for over a century the busiest port in sub-Saharan Africa. And That wonderful aerial photograph on the right shows us the mouth of the harbor, which is that narrow channel where a ship is steaming into it. And then it opens up into a bay, but it's really the sort of Durban harbor is only, honestly, I should know, but 15 square miles max, very small. It actually, ships dock in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, essentially wait their turns to enter the harbor because you only enter in order to load or unload, not to sort of basically dock and wait. Historically, all the commerce was happening on the right-hand side, which is to the north. That was the area called the Point. The beachy area, sort of that's the Indian Ocean side. There's actually great surfing in Durban. But now with containers, all the work moved to the South Harbor, right, which is to the left-hand side of that image. San Francisco shares much in common too, also sort of settled by the US of A in the mid-19th century, right? Although the Spanish had gotten there first, and before them native peoples, of course, right? San Francisco Bay is the single best harbor on the west coast of North America. And therefore, even though it has a very narrow mouth, much larger actually than Durban, but like a half-mile wide, the Golden Gate Bridge built in the 1930s, right? But opens up into this huge San Francisco Bay that's like several hundred square miles, right? If you take in all these bays, right? And all the harbor work really was done on the east side of that peninsula, which is San Francisco, right? And so if you're looking at the map on the left, the southern peninsula is San Francisco. It's labeled, although small, right? And then the work was on the east side of the city because that was protected from the elements, right? It would be stupid to sort of put the harbor on the Pacific coast side, right? That photograph, also a great photograph, right? Really that's right around the founding of the city of San Francisco, even in 1850, right? We can see the harbor choked, right, with sailing ships, right? Because San Francisco was the premier port on the west coast of the US and really America's, North America. LA surpasses the Bay Area, but only in the 1970s as a port, even though LA as a city was much larger, say by the 1920s. Both Durban and San Francisco are also the closest ports to the gold fields, right? And so Durban to Johannesburg, San Francisco in the 19th century to the Sierra, right? Nevada, which is essentially the reasons that these cities became important was because they were the places where gold and then other precious metals are extracted and then sort of exported from, right? And then industry often sort of builds around shipping and mining, right? As the keys. And the Bay Area actually, mining and shipping are the two most important industries in the Bay Area. A lot of people would say tech. Well, maybe in the 21st century, but actually for the first several centuries, that would not have been the case. Ports like Durban and San Francisco and later Oakland, but ports around the world share much in common. And I do like to highlight that. I always say that port cities are my most favorite places. They're interesting places for many reasons. First of all, economically, they're deeply important, generally to their local economies, often to their national economies, but are very much connected. They look outward as opposed to inward, right? To other places, right? They generally are defining of those places, right? Ports, I appreciate that I'm talking to people maybe in New York City. New York City was the greatest port on the East Coast of North America. And even though now all the work is on the New Jersey side, actually New York, New Jersey remains the second biggest port in the US. LA surpassed New York City because so much of our commerce and especially imports come from China, right? And more broadly from Asia, right? These port cities, like I said, Shanghai, you might be compared to Hamburg. The peoples are connected, the economies are connected, the cultures are a bit different. I say that these are cosmopolitan places. What does that mean? It means that there are places where you meet people who are different in terms of their ethnic heritage, different in terms of their culture, different in terms of their religion, different in terms of their ideas, right? That doesn't mean that people get along. Often people who are different don't get along, right? But you're exposed to people, right, who are different. And often that makes you more knowledgeable, right? And not always, but often it makes you more tolerant. And sometimes it makes you actually embrace these other cultures, right? To a lesser extent. Just a couple of years ago, the mayor of Gdansk, the most important port city on the north coast of Poland, was murdered, right? And he was murdered for basically being anti-fascist, excuse me, he was murdered for being anti-fascist, right? But he also was well known for being sympathetic to immigration, right, and sympathetic to homosexuals. And in modern day Poland, those things got him murdered, right? But why was this mayor so progressive? He, according to one of his obituaries, said it's because he's from a port city, right? In other words, that his home place shaped his worldview, right? And I always say for people who know the San Francisco Bay Area, if you think you know the Bay Area, but you don't know the history of the port and the significance of it to the larger culture, you actually don't know the Bay Area, right? You have a false sense of what you know because since its inception, it was really connected to the world through its seaport. I also like to highlight the centrality of shipping and more broadly transport, right, to capitalism. But if we think about the rise of capitalism in the 1500s and the 1600s and the rise of European empire, right, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, etc., those are all done by ship. Right, that is not coincidence. It's actually central, right? So in other words, shipping is the key industry that makes capitalism and imperialism work, right? And even post-imperial Europe, it's still that way. I also like to highlight, as I do in my book, early in my book, that the very word strike is a nautical in origin, right? In 1768 in London, then the biggest port city in the world, because it was the capital of the biggest empire in the world, right? In the 18th and 19th centuries, UK, right? Sailors wanted a raise. They take down the sails of their ship in order to basically stop work, right? In order to press their boss, going, if you want to sort of get this ship moved, you've got to pay us more money. And as some of you may know, the nautical term for taking down the sails of a ship is to strike the sail. And that becomes the de facto word to this day for all work stoppages in the English language, right? That also sort of subtly tells us it's not coincidence that that word came out of the maritime sector. It actually is, nothing is less surprising, right? And so if you learn nothing else, you just learned something that you can win a bar bet. The work of shipping is hard work. I focus largely on those who load and unload ships, as opposed to those who work aboard ships, right? Not sailors and seamen. In other words, I'm talking tonight about dock workers. You might also call them longshoremen. Now we use the gender neutral term longshore workers, but historically all these people were men. There were no women who worked in this occupation for many centuries in most places. This work was considered casual. I put it in air quotes, casual, even though it's actually a full-time career for many, right? What that means in terms of a system is that you don't have a guaranteed job, right? You need to find a job every time, maybe every day, or maybe if you work a ship for 5 days and that ship sails, then you have to find another job, and there is no guarantee you will get one. No one is, in other words, a salaried employee or works for a single company ever. Instead, you have to get hired. And the system of hiring was called the shape up in America. And that basically meant hundreds of men might show up for dozens of jobs at that specific pier, say 7 a.m., right, at Pier 48, right? And, you know, who gets picked? Well, if the boss likes you, if the boss maybe is of the same race, maybe of the same religion, maybe he goes to the same church, maybe lives from the same neighborhood, maybe is related, maybe has given you a bribe, right? Those are the ways you get hired, which is to say it's a very exploitative system that divides workers, results in lower wages, but also weakens workers, right? Because workers see each other as competition and the enemy, as opposed to co-workers, right? If you get hired, the work is really long. 24 hours is not an uncommon shift. Why? Because the ship must sail on time, and very dangerous. Every day you walk onto a pier, you might be killed. It was very common for workers to get in accidents and or worse, right? And so that's the nature of this occupation. It's still a relatively very dangerous job, although less dangerous in the modern era. And, you know, bonus, you also get paid poorly, right? Of course, this is all before health insurance existed, right? Or for that matter, even hospitals, right? And so there's a lot of reasons you might not want this work. Why might you want this work? Well, if you need a job and you can't find anything else, you might sort of, and if you're a young man or even a middle-aged man, in a port city, you might be able to go down to the waterfront and pick up a few days of work or a few years of work, right? If it becomes something more. Now, although I just mentioned that the hiring system actually divides workers, I do want to highlight that the nature of the work also unites workers, separate from the hiring system. No one loads and unloads a ship by themselves. People work in gangs. There might be 20 men to a gang, and there might be 5 to 8 gangs that work a ship to load or unload it. And even within that gang, it was common for people that need to work in pairs, because you got to lift something and it might be really heavy, right? And so even though they were used to lifting heavy loads, they also had to work together, right? And so the industry itself inculcates a collective identity, right? And in addition to the fact that the industry itself gets workers to think about themselves together as opposed to, again, competition. So for example, no dock worker becomes a ship captain. This notion of social mobility that is deeply inculcated into the American mind, that anyone can be rich, and if you were born poor, you can become rich. Such a powerful idea. There are examples of that, but there's a lot more examples of poor people staying poor, right? But in this industry, there aren't any dock workers who become ships captains and owners. And so that's important because what we're seeing also in this industry and in many others is a class consciousness and a class division, right? There is us and there is them, right? You don't relate to the boss, right? And you don't think you're ever going to become the boss, right? And that's important for us to appreciate also. So with that sort of hopefully interesting introduction to dock work, I'll talk a little more about some of the themes of the book that are hopefully of interest. Yeah. I studied, really this book came into existence because I was interested in this issue in particular. There's a long history in the Bay Area, as well as in Durban, of dock workers being really important for their national struggles for racial equality. Right? And this goes back to the 1930s, when dock workers in San Francisco, the biggest port in the West, and still one of the biggest cities in the West, as well as dock workers up and down the entire West Coast, went on strike for the better part of 2 months in the summer of 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression. So for almost 2 months, no cargo was coming in or out of the entire West Coast, right? This was called the Big Strike, right? Out of this big strike came a union that was called the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. In the 1990s, they degendered their name, but for their first 60 years, it was gendered, as are many a union name and many an institution, right? The dock workers were led by a man named Harry Bridges, pictured here, sometimes nicknamed the Nose, who had moved to San Francisco after World War I, after sailing in the Pacific for several years, right? And made San Francisco his home. And under his leadership, this union in the 30s and 40s and then beyond transformed this industry so that West Coast dock workers were among the best paid, strongest, proudest blue-collar workers in America, right? Because of their union. The work had not changed. What had changed was the conditions of the work, because the workers had gained tremendous power and some wealth, right? I should also note that today is actually Harry Bridges' birthday. So happy birthday, Harry, right? And even today, although Harry Bridges died 30 years ago and retired from his post in the 70s, if you meet a dock worker who's in the ILWU and you just say Harry, they knew who you're talking about. By contrast, I am in a teachers union. And let me tell you, 99%, I suspect, of my fellow teacher union members could not tell you that the founding president of the AFT was Albert Schenker, right? And so who are the educated and who are the less educated? Well, I don't know, but I do know that the ILWU, their members know their history and are very proud of it. In the sweep, the general sweep, including Harry Bridges remains a legend. Far from perfect, but nevertheless deeply important and popular. So why? Why was this union so strong, and why was it, in my opinion, so impressive, right? Well, first and foremost, this union, Harry Bridges was often called a communist. He denied the charge, but he said on more than one occasion, well, I'm not a member of the Communist Party, but I actually agree with 95% of what they believe, right? And he and many, many other members of the ILWU in the Bay Area, in LA, in Seattle, were left-wing, right? Some were socialists, some were wobblies, some were communists, some were Trotskyists, Some weren't affiliated with any particular left tradition. But we have to understand that, because after this union gained power in the 1930s, one of the things they did was they took control of the hiring process. So they got rid of the shape-up, which was so oppressive, so divisive, and so sort of drove down wages. Instead, employers had to call up the union hall, and the union would dispatch its own members to the job. So the union got to control who got picked. First of all, this was egalitarian in that it was anti-racist, so that they didn't dispatch based on race, ethnicity, or etc. Right? If you were a member of the union, you were treated equally. I'll come back to whether or not in practice that was the way it worked, but like in principle, that was very clear. But also that the union locals elected their own dispatchers. And so every year, if you didn't like who was picking who got the job, not only were they your union brother, right? If you didn't like them, you could replace them, right? Like, and so democratically controlled, right? And what was called the low man out system. So if 100 people show up for dispatch, that sort of photograph on the top shows people lining up, right, to sort of essentially pick a job, right? Like, and then that left image is of the sort of the board. Those are the jobs available, right? Say for that shift, right? Like 100 people show up. Who gets to pick? Who gets the first job? Low man out. What does that mean? It means if in that quarter of the year, you have the fewest amount of hours worked, you get the first opportunity to pick a job that day, right? The last shall be first, right? You might call this Christianity. I call it socialism, right? And these people were committed to these ideas. So this union created this system, very unusual, right? But these are examples of how you operationalize these principles in practice, right? To create a much more egality. So they can't equalize the earnings because different people work different amounts of hours, right? But they can equalize the opportunities as well as, of course, equalize the wages, right? In addition, this union very quickly demonstrated it was anti-racist. In 1934, when the union was born, 99% of the San Francisco Bay Area local, which became known as Local 10, was white. So when I say 99%, that's not an exaggeration, right? It was literally 99% white. However, during World War II, a growing number of Black people moved to the Bay Area, including for shipbuilding jobs, but some ended up on the waterfront, including this man named Cleophas Williams, pictured on the left. And Cleophas came from rural Arkansas in 1942, got a job on the waterfront by 1944. And as he put it in a later interview, when it came to the waterfront, many Black workers felt Local 10 was a utopia. Cleophas, who I got to know late in his life, he died about 5 years ago, essentially said to me, it's the first white people who, as far as I know, weren't racist, right? So it was, I would have thought and said, I didn't say it to his face, well, actually, they might have been racist because in our hearts of hearts, who knows what people think. But in practice, they actually were demonstrating their racial equality, right? Like, and so as more Black people enter the union, of course, it becomes that much easier to sort of enforce equality because members have the power, right? And so, but at first, it was set up by white leftists, right, in this fashion. I should note, as some of you may know, the ILW was not the only union in the 1930s to sort of be committed to these ideals, right? Most of these unions that were born in the 30s that were affiliated with the Congress of Industrial Organizations also sort of were better than other unions that existed already when it came to organizing African Americans, Mexicans, women, etc. After the war, after World War II, which had seen a huge spike in shipping, which meant a huge spike in work, there's a contraction, right? What happens? All those new Black guys who get into the union, are they sort of then dropped in the Bay Area? No. There actually was this huge meeting in 1947 that Cleophas attended among the members where they talked about, should we reduce our union ranks because we have less jobs? Less jobs equals less money, right? Like, and rather than purge, say 1,000 Black men, because everyone knew that almost all the new guys were Black, right? They would actually just work fewer hours, right? And so that was a profound moment in this history of this union because they were basically saying, we will starve together, right? Rather than, you know, sorry, but you're new and I got to pay for me and my family, and therefore we're going to exclude you from the union moving forward because there's fewer jobs, right? Like, and so when Local 10 did this, that was a profound moment. I should note that that was not the case in Local 13, LA, where they did in fact cut their newer members, which was to say their African-American members who had come on to the waterfront during World War II, right? Like, so even within the ILW, there is divergence, right? The Bay Area local was particularly progressive on this issue, but also on many others. And by the late 60s, Local 10, by that time, largely the shipping is in Oakland, not in San Francisco. It's Black majority. Cleophas, the image I showed you, was the first Black president of the local, and we see this profound transformation, right? They work in many other ways, right, to sort of fight for racial equality. Sometimes historians like me call this civil rights unionism. So that Bill Chester pictured here, who was another of those Black men who moved from, well, originally he was from Louisiana, but then he had moved to other places and then California in the 40s, right? Like Chester becomes the leader, leading the highest ranking elected leader who is Black in the ILW. And they push other locals within the Bay Area to open up their ranks. Dock workers load and unload ships. Clerks are the information trackers, but they're also in the union, but a different local, right? The clerks had held out and were all white still by the early 60s, right? But with Bridges and Chester and some other support, Local 34 opens up to Blacks. Now it is also majority Black in Local 34. If you know San Francisco well, I know Mia does. You know, the Local 34 dispatch hall is just north of San Francisco Giants Stadium, right? If you might actually have noticed, there's a little union hall with a parking lot just north of Giant Stadium. They refused to sell, right? When they were developing that new baseball field. It used to be further south at a place called Candlestick. So I do want to highlight that it varied by local. Local 8, I know that Portland sometimes people think is progressive, not really when it comes to race. In fact, Oregon has some of the most racist history in the country. And Local 8 had no Black members for decades, despite the union's overall commitment. And there was this long struggle to sort of open up Local 8. And ultimately that worked, although the Portland area doesn't have many African Americans, although it's become more diverse in recent decades, right? Local 13, I already mentioned. LA is really important for us to understand this because now LA is the big port, right? And so I'm highlighting the Bay Area because historically it was the most important place, but in current times, Local 13, if you know anyone in Local 13 or around Local 13, that's important because we want more of them to be more progressive, right? Like, yeah. Just sort of one more thing before I talk a little about Durban. You know, in 1967, Martin Luther King visited Local 10's hall, which is still in the same place, 400 North Point, right near Fisherman's Wharf. And he was made an honorary member. Before him, Paul Robeson, the smiling man on the right-hand side of that photograph, with 2 friends of his who were in the ILW, was inducted into the Union during World War II. And then last month, or Juneteenth 2021, right, Angela Davis was also inducted into Local 10 as an honorary member. So Angela Davis, Martin Luther King, and Paul Robeson, you could say that they might be the 3 most important Black progressives in the history of the United States of America, all have a personal relationship with this union, right? Even though it's a small union, right? Like, but it's a small union with an incredibly militant history and politics. You know, I'm gonna move a little faster for the sake of time. Let me tell you a little about Durban, a place that you probably know less well, right? And so in Durban, all the dock workers were Black, right? Even before apartheid was formally created, jobs were segregated based on race: Black, white, Indian, or colored, which is a legal category historically in South Africa that defines mixed race people. Who's a colored person? Now in America, they would just be Black. Barack Obama is not called mixed race, he's called Black. Why? Because in America, if any of your ancestors are Black, you're Black, right? But in South Africa, the acknowledgement that actually there was some European ancestry in these people, they're called colored. So there was 4 categories in South Africa traditionally before 1994. Now, of course, among Black people, there's multiple different ethnic groups, really sort of 9 large ethnic groups among Native Africans. And Zulu is probably the best known. It is also the largest numerically. It's also the Zulus are sort of inhabit the area where Durban is, right? But west of there, but not far from there, is an area that's now called the Eastern Cape. And there are Pondos who also sort of worked on the waterfront. Pondos don't speak Pondo. Pondo actually speak Xhosa. Xhosa, which is another language of Native Africans, right? Dock workers in South Africa experienced similar work to dock workers in the Bay Area before 1934. And just like dock workers in the Bay Area, there's a long history of dock workers in South Africa who legally could not unionize because they were Black and legally could not strike because they were Black, nevertheless organized unofficially, and so not officially in unions, but in sort of self-organized in sort of informal ways, but also stopped work repeatedly, which in South African often is referred to as downing your tools. During World War II and for years after, they struck repeatedly on more than a dozen occasions in the 1940s and 50s. In America, many dock workers believed that the war was worth fighting for, and so lots of workers in World War II took a no strike pledge. What do Black South Africans care about white people fighting in Europe, right? Like, and so you know, the war is just an opportunity actually to squeeze their white bosses because there's a lot more shipping coming through, and this is a great opportunity, right? In Durban, which is the third biggest city in South Africa, as well as the biggest port, right? A lot of people came to appreciate that the dock workers were the most well-organized and militant workers in Durban. And that is why in the 1950s, as this quote says, a victory of the dock workers is a victory for the working class. I do want to note that although dock workers in Durban often struck for a raise because they were generally very poor, they increasingly by the 1950s coordinated their work stoppages with other political organizations, including the South African Congress of Trade Unions pictured here, and the African National Congress, the ANC, which is better known. The ANC's union arm was SACTU. And so essentially they would organize stayaways, which is a euphemism for a strike. Blacks could not legally strike, but you could encourage workers to stay away, which is to say the same thing, right? And so dock workers were very important in the 40s and 50s to resist apartheid in Durban, but in other places, right? And I also should note that outside of South Africa, something was similar. So in the late colonial era, after World War II in Africa, in Mombasa, which was the biggest port in Kenya, and in East Africa, dock workers were central to the Kenyan liberation struggle. In West Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, right, dock workers were really important in Portuguese West Africa, et cetera, right? After massive government repression in the late 50s, early 60s, and mid 60s, opposition to apartheid in South Africa basically stopped. This is referred to in South African history as the Quiet Decade, because essentially all the activists had either been killed, jailed, went underground, or went into exile, or shut up, right? And so it was literally the dock workers in Durban who were the largest strike of Black workers during the Quiet Decade, 1969, and then they threatened to strike in 71, and then in late 1972, they struck again, demonstrating that despite repression, they had maintained some ability to organize, but also were willing to stop work despite ferocious repression, and then played a crucial role, therefore, in what becomes known as the Durban Strikes of 1973, which is when basically the domestic anti-apartheid movement reasserted itself after being, quote, quiet. So that's basically me saying how dock workers within their own countries can exert power on issues of racial equality, anti-apartheid in South Africa, civil rights as we call it in the US, right? The second theme of my book really looks at the sort of transformation of shipping into its modern day form, where you have these mega ships with 20,000 containers on them, right? That suddenly become news when one blocks the Suez Canal, and then essentially world shipping comes to a collapse, right? For a week earlier this year, right? Like it's an example of basically how containerization, like other aspects of capitalism, sometimes contain the seeds of their own demise, right? But we're not going to talk about that now. We instead will talk for the duration of my time, talking about how dock workers in Durban, but also in the Bay Area, were contributed to struggles to help people that they don't even know, right? And so I say, like, okay, I'm fighting for racial equality in my home place. I know a lot of African Americans. And so if George Floyd gets murdered, I might think that could have happened to my friend, even though I'm a white guy. And so therefore, maybe I want to join a protest, right? But what about if something's happening, oppression is occurring in another country? Are you and I willing to sort of step up for them? I've never met them. I've never been to that place. I will never go to that place, right? Being part of a protest, actually, there's some risk involved. Am I willing to do that? Right? And the answer is some of us are sometimes, right? And that dock workers have a long history of this sort of activism. And so why is that? Well, first of all, there's a long history of Black men and some Black women engaging, working in the industry of shipping, right? Ousmane Sembène's a legendary man originally from Senegal, who lived in France, and actually was a dock worker in Marseille, the biggest French port on the Mediterranean, right? Like the man on the right, Claude McKay, was a Jamaican, right? Who lived much of his adult life in Harlem, in New York City, right? But before living in New York, actually had been a sailor, right? Marcus Garvey had been a dock worker in London. Langston Hughes had worked on ships before he was able to make a living as a poet and writer. It's sort of amazing, actually, how many Black people have worked in this industry going back centuries, right? That introduces them to people elsewhere. They get to meet people who are different, but also who are similar, in this case, people of African descent, right? Like they also sort of start to develop a Black politics that connects people from the African continent to Black people in the diaspora, in the Americas particularly, right? Some of these people are overtly anti-capitalist, right? Including Sembène and McKay, but we might add many others to the list that I'll talk about. In fact, it was Black people in Dakar, in Paris, in London, in New York City, in Chicago, who organized protests when the Italian fascists invaded Ethiopia in 1935, right? And so although lots of us have heard of the Spanish Civil War, right, which actually is later, right? And a lot of people know that some lefties, including communists, traveled to Spain to fight in the international brigades, which is a noteworthy chapter in the history of the international left. It actually is preceded by, right, anti-fascist organizing by Black people and white allies against to protect, well, ultimately Ethiopia was defeated, right? And Italy conquered Ethiopia in that war in 1935. But it's actually sort of a sister chapter to the Spain part of the 1930s anti-fascism, but far less familiar. I am, however, going to talk about the global struggle against apartheid. Why? It's actually why I started to study South Africa, because a great many of us who aren't South Africans are deeply impressed by the history of the struggle against apartheid, starting in the 19-teens and 20s and picking up in the 40s and 50s and continuing to the 1990s. Some people would say it's the most important movement, social movement of the post-World War II era. What would be the most important social movement of the 19th century? I would say it would be the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and then the abolition of slavery, which was a global movement also, although really in Europe and the Americas and Africa, right? Like, so the Atlantic world, right, might be the 19th century version, right, of a successful global movement, right, against what was seen as an immoral institution. Yeah. So in 1962, Bill Chester, who I introduced a little earlier, coordinating with the white woman pictured in the photograph in the center on the right, a woman named Mary Louise Hooper, a white American progressive, right, hatch a plan to basically throw up a small community picket in front of a large group of dock workers who already knew in advance that this picket was going to be showing when a Dutch ship carrying South African cargo showed up in San Francisco in 1962. Right? And this is the first documented example of American workers, although specifically in this case, dock workers, refusing to work, which is to say strike, to protest what South Africa's white minority regime was doing to its Black majority, right? Like, now, other countries, we saw actually some similar actions happening in the same era, but in the US, this was the first, right? Like that photo on the right actually comes from the Union's newspaper, which had a brief story on it shortly after, right? Fast forward to the mid-1970s. So in 1976, students in Soweto, the sort of large township outside of Johannesburg in South Africa, rise up to protest against apartheid. That Soweto student uprising spreads across South Africa, and it becomes the largest, basically a significant expansion of the protest movement in country. And then what it also did was elevate this issue globally as well, so that people, including Leo Robinson, photographed on the right, with allies of his, all of whom are on the left in that photograph from 1977, form within the Union, Local 10 of the ILW, the Southern Africa Liberation Support Committee, and to do what it, just like the name says. So a few points. First of all, this union at its regular monthly meeting, basically a rank and file member proposed we should have a new committee focused on liberation in Southern Africa. that's already pretty interesting, right? Like, who does that, right? Like, well, guess what? All these people are left wing, right? Some of them are African American. They come from different politics. Some were communists, some were, you might call, new left. Some were more pan-Africanist. Some were really sort of focused largely on Black trade union issues, but they all sort of shared a common sympathy for what was going on in Southern Africa, not South Africa, because actually at that time, Namibia was still essentially a colony of South Africa. Zimbabwe was still called Rhodesia, which was ruled by a white minority regime. And Mozambique was just liberated from Portuguese control, but was descending into a civil war that was really stoked by white South Africans and the US government, which was trying to foment basically a counter-revolution because they didn't like liberation of Black people in Southern Africa, right? Like, not unlike the attempts of the US to overthrow the Cuban government after the Cuban Revolution succeeded in the early 60s, right? Like, and so these people and some of their friends do things like raise food, donations, medical donations. They got a shipping company to donate a few containers, and they shipped it to Dar es Salaam in East Africa because Tanzania had become essentially the regional center for liberation struggles in exile. So that South Africans, Mozambicans, Zimbabweans, right, were all given safe haven, right, by the socialist Pan-African government led by Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. And so they shipped these containers, and then this stuff was distributed, right? Like, and so although stop work is important, they also engaged in other solidarity work, right? To feed and clothe, right, those who were in exile. 1984, this same group of people showed this documentary film at their union meeting. That film is called Las Timbaza. I encourage you to try to find this film, but it is hard to find. It was made in the early 1970s in South Africa, smuggled out, and was widely shown in the 70s and 80s around the world, because after you watch this 1-hour film, you understand why you should hate apartheid, right? Maybe you thought you did, you watch this film, and then you become more knowledgeable about, the oppression that Black people suffered, right? So this film was shown at the October meeting of the Local 10, and then, as planned, someone got up and made a motion. I propose we refuse to work the next ship that comes in with South African cargo. 400 men unanimously vote, right, to not touch South African cargo, because they watched this film, but also because their coworkers and their fellow union brothers had educated them over the course of a number of years, right, about why this was a cause that was worthy of their interest, right? So when that ship came in a few weeks later, for 10 days, dock workers refused to unload that ship. It became a big local and then national story, right? On the 11th day, they unloaded, right? And this strike was very influential upon the Bay Area anti-apartheid movement, but also more broadly in the US. 6 years later, Nelson Mandela, pictured here with his then wife, Winnie, visited the US after he was released from prison. He would be elected president 4 years after this. He took a 10-day tour of the US, including New York City. I was a college student in the summer of 1990, living in New York City, but I was a dumb college student, and so I did not attend his legendary speech at Yankee Stadium because, what can I say? I was not woke. But later on his tour, his final stop on the tour was actually in Oakland, where he spoke to a sold-out crowd at Oakland Coliseum, and he spent 10% of his speech talking about what I just talked about in the previous slide, right? That Local 10 had stepped up. And so he was thanking the dock workers for their commitment to that cause, right? A high watermark for them. In Durban, similar activism happens, right? Like in 2008, dock workers would engage in action. Dock workers, after apartheid ends, ultimately form a union called SATAWU, the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union. In 2008, to the north of South Africa is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, however, is not on the coast, it's landlocked. All shipping comes in and out of South Africa that goes to Zimbabwe, or they ship through Mozambique. But Maputo, the big city in Mozambique, is a much smaller place. It's a much poorer country. South Africa is where most of the stuff that goes in and out of Zimbabwe comes. Think of Zimbabwe and South Africa like the US and Mexico, right? Share a border, share many people, share culture, share economic relations, share political ties, right? For centuries, right? Not just for a few months or years, right? And so in 2008, when the then president of Zimbabwe, who recently died, Robert Mugabe, was basically trying to sort of deny his opponent an election for president. His opponent, Robert Mugabe's opponent, was a man named Morgan Tsvangirai, pictured here. Tsvangirai was actually a union leader, right? When basically Mugabe used mass violence in order to beat up his opponent and kill hundreds of people and injure thousands. Many South Africans were paying attention, right? And actually many Zimbabweans live in South Africa. When this Chinese ship came into Zimbabwe, South African Durban harbor in spring of 2008, April 2008, loaded with weapons for Zimbabwe, right? These dock workers refused to unload this ship because they were sympathetic to the opposition movement in Zimbabwe. I interviewed actually the leaders of this action in 2010, 2 years later in Durban, right? And they said, well, we know that Zimbabwe was very supportive of us in the 1980s, right? After Zimbabwe was born, right? And gave safe haven to South Africans in exile. We know that these are workers, right? And the labor movement, right? And we think that Zimbabwe's government oppresses the Zimbabwean people. That's why so many had fled for South Africa. And so therefore we took a stand with the people of Zimbabwe, right? This was in opposition to what the formal government wanted, because the leader of South Africa's government at that time, Thabo Mbeki, was friends with Robert Mugabe, right? And so these dock workers defied their own national government's foreign policy in refusing to work this ship, which then sailed away. They attempted to unload it in Mozambique, but dock workers there also refused, and the ship sailed back to China. Mugabe still was able to hold on to that election. It did not end up sort of resulting in him losing power at that time, but it's an impressive example, right? Now, I know that a lot of you are much more familiar with recent issues, but I did want to highlight those. The ILW's opposition to Israeli treatment of Palestinians goes back to the 1980s and the 1990s. Leo Robinson, the leader of Local 10's anti-apartheid activism, was actually one of the people who wrote the resolutions at the ILW conventions in the 1990s to condemn the Israeli government's treatment of the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, but more broadly across Palestine. So prior to recent events where many of us have become more interested in Palestine, in fact, the ILW, this working class union, right, that doesn't actually ship much stuff to the Middle East because it's in the Pacific, right, was already engaged. In 2010 and then in 2014, community pickets led by a group called the American Resource Organizing Committee, AROC, which is now sort of a small, well-known group among activist circles, threw up picket lines in the Port of Oakland, and then already having informed Local 10 people in advance, right? Those union members refused to cross that community picket, and therefore these Israeli-owned ships owned by a company called ZIM, sailed away without having unloaded 2 years ago to protest the Saudi war in Yemen, which is one of the most horrible wars in the world. French and Italian dockers did something similar. They refused to load weapons aboard a Saudi ship pictured above because the Saudis, who of course receive much of their military aid also from the United States, I should say not aid, but the Saudis actually pay for American military hardware, right? The French and Italian dockers refused to sort of work that ship. Last year in 2020, when Chile was in the midst of a huge protest movement against its own government and also pushing for a new constitutional convention, dock workers in many countries, part of something called the International Dockers Council, actually said that they would not work cargo from Chile to protest the government then, which is no longer the government. In fact, the government fell and a better government was sort of emerged out of that situation. And then last year, after George Floyd was killed, Juneteenth became suddenly a much better known event in American history, especially among non-Black people, right? And you may know that in Juneteenth 2020, the ILW shut down for 8 hours all 29 ports on the US West Coast in solidarity with Juneteenth, but also in sympathy with the victim, George Floyd, and his family, right? And Angela Davis actually spoke at that Port of Oakland event that sort of became sort of a famous moment too. That was when she said, if I had not become a professor, I would have liked to have become a longshore worker or warehouse worker so that I could be in the ILWU. Of course, this summer, Block the Boat, as it has been named by AROC, sort of when Israel once more started to kill more people in Gaza, and also after Palestinians in East Jerusalem being sort of forced out of their longtime homes, right? Protests within Palestine grow, and then sort of solidarity with that, especially after Israelis start killing so many Palestinians in Gaza and in Jerusalem, right? Once more, right, in Oakland, sort of the Block the Boat campaign reemerges. It also spreads to other US Pacific ports like Los Angeles and Seattle. It also spread northward into British Columbia and Canada, where there was also Block the Boat spread. But even before Block the Boat had emerged in sort of May, June of 2021 in the US, dock workers in Italy were the first this year to refuse to work an Israeli-owned ship. But also in Durban, there was protest against an Israeli-owned ship that came in. The photograph on the right is from a protest in Durban, right, in May of this year. And so Abahale is actually a social movement that is sympathetic to and works often with unions, right, that had organized. And so the community support was there, was coming from this shack dwellers movement. So to conclude, I have tried to explain why dock workers are so powerful is because they play such an important role in global trade. And so, not all of us actually work in sort of the most important industry in the world. Most of us don't, right? But those in transportation generally and shipping specifically do have tremendous power and a long history of activism. Even today, 90% of all things that you consume have been moved by ship for at least part of their journey, either in raw material or in the finished product or both, right? And so what that means is that even today, shipping, not just transportation, but specifically shipping, is pivotal, right, to the world as we know it, right, and to our global economy. But when workers organize collectively, they have been able to sort of exert that power on behalf of themselves, but also in favor of Black equality, in favor of liberation struggles in other countries. Although the technology has changed and actually weakened workers in some ways, dock workers continue to be quite powerful. And the examples from this past few months in solidarity with Palestinian liberation are only the latest example. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope it was of interest. And I look forward to talking with anyone who wishes to sort of ask questions or make comments.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a really informative presentation, and we have many, many questions, but there's three in particular that I would like to get to, and I know that you mentioned it, and I'm now giving you the opportunity to talk about it, but like you said, a big theme in your book is containerization and how it threatened and continues to threaten jobs and dock worker union power in both the SF and Durban examples. But you also note that the 2008 Durban strike against military cargo to Zimbabwe was an example of this labor power resurging in the face of automation. And maybe we don't have time to sort of get into the history of containerization. Folks can definitely check out your book to learn more about that context. But a question from our organizing cohort that they had is, in the era of digitization, modern tools, and worker isolation, what can we learn from these dock workers in order to better understand or subvert new technology for our movement?
Yeah, so, well, that's a big and great question. If I don't answer it all, Mia, feel free to push back or just remind me. So like automation is ongoing, right, in many fields, including in dock work. So although containerization, even before containerization, sometimes there were improvements in cranes, right? But containerization was such a game changer because it essentially resulted in, over time, over the course of a generation, the work of what had been, say, in the San Francisco Bay Area, done by 5,000, was done by closer to 750, right? And so and productivity increased, right? Now, in the case of the ILW and some other unions that had the ability to command, had some power, dock worker earnings significantly increased. So labor costs actually went down as a percent of shipping costs. But because there are so many fewer workers, and because they also had the power to basically negotiate well, right? Dock workers actually became a very lucrative line of work. That's why now tens of thousands of people try to get into the union whenever they announce openings to apply to. And I've joked on more than one occasion not unlike Angela Davis, right? Like the average dock worker in say LA makes more than the average professor, right? Like right, as a parallel, right, or a comparison. Even now, automation is moving forward further. Now, dock workers actually argue that at this point, it's not about productivity, but it's just obviously about power, right? Because guess what? That robot's not going to stop, perhaps, if an Israeli-owned ship comes in and they don't like the politics of that shipping line, right? Like, and so it's not clear if automation at this point in this specific industry is about really productivity gains, but really simply about who has a brain, right? And who is, and are you willing to be an automaton, right? Or an independent thinker, right? Like obviously in many other lines of work, there's similar issues. I mean, we're talking via Zoom and I'm a professor, and do we need less professors because we can sort of virtually teach, right? Even post-COVID, I don't know, maybe, right? Like, of course, maybe we, let me tell you that the educational outcomes are, I think, inferior, right? Like I actually find that my students don't learn as much when they learn online, but the logic, quote unquote, of capitalism is only about profit, not about quality, right? Like, so my point being is that it's not just transport, but also even say the education industry, which is also very much sort of in the sights, right? Especially as fewer and fewer rich people contribute much money in their taxes. And so we all fight over government dollars, but essentially those with most of the wealth are not contributing, or contributing less than they used to, right? Like, what might we do about these things is, well, like, I mean, when we have unions, right, we have the ability to negotiate, even if we might be junior partners. Dock workers specifically, but all workers have a great power, and that power is to not work, right? And so the Wobblies famously, Big Bill Haywood said, the greatest power of workers is to put your hands in your pockets, right? Like to stop work. Workers need to be coordinated and organized in order to be, and then be willing, right? But strikes remain in the 21st century as they were when that term was born, right, in the 18th century, the single greatest weapon that workers have, right? Like we should know that, right? Like there has been a slight uptick in strikes in America in the last couple of years. But if you compare, for instance, the number of strikes, the number of workers involved in strikes, as well as the number of strikes, compared to the 30s, 40s, 50s, or even the 60s, the numbers are like, we now have like dozens of strikes or a few hundred, whereas we used to have thousands of strikes every year. Workers have been very much weakened now, and although some unions have been part of the problem, it's generally employers and the government that has essentially instituted policies that have weakened us, right? Like, so a long way around to the answer to the question is, like, we need more unions, in my opinion, if we want to resist automation that is in fact will hurt us, right? Like, and if we don't, well, the contrast in my book, right, when it comes to this issue, and then I'll shut up, is in the Bay Area, dock workers, when this new technology, containers, were introduced in the 60s, not a single worker lost their job. They negotiated that, right? Like, and so what they did is they got a bunch of money, millions of dollars, which now would be tens of millions of dollars, from the employers. And they basically shrunk from the top, which is they essentially got older members to retire early for money, right? Like, and so rather than lay off anyone, right? Now that doesn't solve the problem longer term. Their children and their children's children, there are fewer jobs available, right? But at the least you protect those who are the most immediately impacted by technological change, right? And they negotiated much higher wages and other things, right? In Durban, in the 70s, the late 70s is when containers were introduced. Dock workers were, I mentioned that they were militant and strong and engaged in work stoppages, but containerization is introduced, it will weaken workers. Durban dockers don't, and no dock workers in South Africa have unions because they're all black, right? They're not allowed to, right? Like they can't strike, although they did sometimes, right? In companies, which is basically the government, and it was very corporatized, statist, they introduced containers, 50% of the workers are laid off inside of a year, and they don't get a dime extra in wages, right? And so in that part of my book, although some parts of my book shows similarities, that part of my book shows a contrast, right? Those who had a powerful union were able to negotiate a much better deal. Those who did not have a union basically got screwed, right? Like, And that's the short version of history, you might say. Actually, yeah. Those who have the power to protect themselves might survive better, and those who don't suffer the consequences, right? And so I'm not sure if I touched on all of that question. If not, please come back to me.
No, that was a good answer. I think a little bit in sort of relation to that, something that our organizers were really interested in, something that I'm definitely interested in, is from your book, and from reading it became very clear, and something that you mentioned earlier is how ILW workers have a very sharp and clear sense of their history, and it seems that most, at least in your examples from the strikes in the 70s and the 80s, and even the one in 2008, are able to very clearly articulate their political position in the face of opposition. And it seems that most workers can do that. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering if you can share a little bit, and I know you talked about sort of the movie screenings that workers would watch, but what kinds of political education existed within these unions and in times of mobilizations? And follow up to that is, what do you think was effective about this, and what do you think we can learn from that today?
Wonderful. So first point I should make is that let's remember that in any movement, including a union, there's some people who do a lot of the work and a lot who do little, right? And so some of us use the term militant minority, right? This is the case whether we're talking about the civil rights movement in the 1960s or say anti-apartheid activism in the unions in the 1980s, right? A small group of people who are willing to commit their time and effort, right? Can often move a larger force, right? Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, of course, said this, right? A small group of people can change the world, right? So we keep that in mind, right? And so there's a lot of members of the LW who might be proud of their union, but actually don't take the time, make the effort to sort of commit to this. Maybe they're busy, right? Maybe they're tired, or maybe they're apathetic, right? That's the case, right? So even within the LW, which has this, I think I highlight really a lot of sort of celebratory, in my opinion. The way I describe this union is often very positive, right? I don't want to over push that too much, because there's dead weight, right? Who basically are take advantage, right? That is the case. If we look at 1960s Mississippi, most Black people didn't participate in the civil rights movement. They might have supported it, but actually it was a few percent who were the ones who were putting their bodies on the line, right? What does that mean? It means that so too in our time, right? You might think, well, there's a lot of apathy, or people are tired and busy and don't have the ability and time, right? That should not get us too depressed, because that was the case in the past too, right? And that a well-organized small group of people, of course, you need to have the trust, respect, and faith of your peers, right? So the larger mass needs to be able to trust and know that the people who are the organizers are the ones who were worthy of believing, right? That was the case, right? Now, how do they do that, right? Well, I think, first of all, you actually have to be just a good member of whatever that organization is, right? So that people don't think that you're a lazy bum, right? But who talks a lot about politics, right? There are some people who do that, right? In every political organization, they talk a lot, do nothing, right? So too in the LW, right? So you have to be able, demonstrate yourself so that you can earn people's trust. I think that's important. The education piece that you ask about, right? The film that you give is a good example. This group of people had used these same educational tools, not just for the union, but also they would student groups, religious groups, et cetera, right? So they also try to go beyond, but it was Leo Robinson once more, this Black man and native Oaklander, second generation dock worker, who was the leader of the anti-apartheid activism in the Bay Area, and his photographs are featured prominently in my presentation. He was also one of the people who got the local to create an education committee, right? So that all new members have to go through a series of educational meetings. What that looks like varies, and it would always vary by the union and the place, I'm sure, right? And so if you want to be in this union, because most people want to be in this union for one reason, they get paid well, right? Some people want to be in the union for other reasons in addition, but no one's upset about the pay, right? Okay, you want to join a union? In order to sort of get your full registration, you have to do these things, right? So that was very clever. I should note that Leo Robinson didn't have a high school degree, he actually dropped out of high school, went into the Navy, right? Very smart, very well read, but very little formal education, right? So I always like to distinguish between education and intelligence, right? He's smart, but he didn't finish high school, right? But nevertheless, he's a believer in education, right? Like that's worthy of note, right? Like as far as what I think even the institutions that we have, we need to sort of invigorate. And then the last example I'll give is, again, my union, the American Federation of Teachers. I'm a professor. When I got this job at Western Illinois University, I was thrilled that there was a union in place. I didn't help create it. Most professors have no idea what a union is, don't think that unions are for us. They think they're for steelworkers or something like that. In other words, this blue collar, white collar divide, which is artificial, right? It's an example of basically working people buying into the system in ways that therefore weaken us because they don't think that they need a collective voice, right? Like, however, guess what? The AFT and my local don't have an education committee. We are educators. We don't tell people why they should be in a union. We somehow assume that people will want to be in a union, and that's a false assumption, right? Like the fact that teachers, at least in my local, don't have a committee to sort of teach us about why unions matter, as well as the history of our union. That's an example of a failure in my part, right? Like, and so I would suggest that all of us who are in unions need to sort of be not just organizing new workers, yes, but, taking for granted that, like, upwards of a third of union members voted for Donald Trump, who's anti-union, right? Like, and so what does that mean? It means that we have work to do within our labor movement in addition to growing it, right? Like, and so I think that's actually another way that this militant minority, if someone volunteers to take on work, most people are just say, thanks, run with it, right? Like, and so who's watching this event? Probably people who have an activist inclination already, right? Like, and so that's the point, right? Like, is that we need to do more, even if we're already doing a lot.
Great, thank you. Then another question that came from our organizers, and that I'm very interested in, but is sort of kind of open-ended, is can the history of dockworker internationalism offer lessons for the movement to end US unilateral sanctions? And you can definitely speak more to the contemporary context or
US international sanctions in Cuba?
Unilateral sanctions imposed on various countries. We know that Iran is under sanctions, okay. Venezuela. If you have any examples.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I haven't thought about that, right? And I guess the answer is hypothetically, yes. I can't think of an example of a union taking on that particular issue. I mean, what are the big issues that war, right? Like, is one, right? That's not sanctions, but like, I think unions do have a role to play, not just in the US, in the domestic struggle against South African apartheid, which I talk a lot about Durban. Workers are really important, not just in Durban on the waterfront, but actually in many other fields and many other cities. And so, like, I do think the labor movement can shape politics, including formal policy. In terms of foreign policy, right? It's usually not the sort of issue, right, that a union takes on. Right? Like, why would they? Well, are there members? If we're thinking about Iran, Iranian sanctions are so terrible for the people of Iran. What can we do? That's a great question. I don't know, honestly. I like if that's, I think that the examples of that come to mind of how can workers exert power on international affairs, right? Like, the state is not the only actor, right? Like, and so, for example, a couple years ago, I think it was 2019, right, when some workers at a company called Wayfair in the Boston area, right, were upset because their company had contracts with ICE and they were supplying furniture, right, to detention centers in South Texas, right? And so there was not really, there was sort of more talk about it, but it was sort of a protest about going, we don't want our company, right, to sort of be engaged in this way. Since corporations, as we know, right, are powerful actors too, right? Maybe the way to sort of get at sanctions, I honestly don't know, but in terms of influencing, the border issues are sort of internationalist by nature, I guess. That's what comes to mind, right? Like, I think that generally when dock workers have exerted power or other sorts of workers, it's to protest the politics of another government, right? Not necessarily its own government. Although in principle, workers could sort of engage in that sort of, it wouldn't be a work stoppage, right? Because like if we already have sanctions against Iran, it's not like we're delivering goods to Iran. So I'm not sure, honestly, if workplace action is the best approach, right? Even if unions should support those sorts of things. And some unions, of course, issue resolutions. How important do they sort of, do those statements become? It depends, I suppose, right? Like, I think the short answer is I don't have a good answer.
Thank you. That works too. Sometimes we don't have answers right away, but we're learning towards them. And I guess to extend it more to the like contemporary context, and you mentioned sort of the uptick in worker strikes in the past couple of years. If you could sort of draw some parallels, I guess, between, particularly to me, it's interesting how strong the ILW is, but drawing some parallels between ILW union organizing and the current organizing struggles we see today, from the sort of the Bessemer, Alabama case, which isn't sort of an ongoing struggle, but in some ways it is, to the current sort of Frito-Lay worker struggles. If you could draw out some parallels in terms of tactics, strategy, context.
Yeah, I think those are important questions. I mean, the first and most obvious parallel is that like the attempt to organize warehouse workers in Bessemer is also the same industry, what now we often call logistics, right? Or supply chain, right? Which is, I often use the term transport, right? But it's all the same, right? Like, I think it's important to appreciate that dock workers are not special, right? They're just well organized at what some of us call a choke point, right? But there are many choke points. Another metaphor is, right, like the sort of, any chain is only as strong as its weakest link. That weakest link is the choke point, right? Like, so what does that mean? Well, actually, there's other unions and that exist in this industry. The Teamsters come to mind, right? Like, so the Teamsters are actually the largest union in the country, right? They have a history of militancy, but they also are known for being conservative in some ways, right? Not committed to sort of socialism, let alone something of that sort, but also with a long history of corruption within the union, meaning in this case, a lack of democracy, right? Like, so that you can't elect your own leaders, you can't replace them, right? Like you're sort of stuck, right? Like, and if you complain, you might get hurt, right? Like that's less so in the present than in the past, but like, nevertheless, the Teamsters are important, right? Like, because they're strong. And they have a long history of respecting other workers' strikes, meaning they don't cross picket lines, right? And if you get the Teamsters on your side and your company is on strike, that means that the goods, right, the raw materials that your company might need don't get delivered, right? Because the Teamsters won't deliver. Although it was the retail workers, right, who were organizing, attempting to organize in Alabama. The Teamsters also could be a better union because of its larger numbers and strength to organize. And, you know, what at their last convention, they just recently announced that they're going to try to help organize Amazon workers. I think that that's very important for a bunch of reasons. One, COVID has, further revealed the centrality of this industry, right? Especially, honestly, delivering at home or delivering to a store where you might pick it up, right? Like ultimately, most of the transportation is the same. It's just the sort of the last mile, if you will. But organizing this industry is super important. Amazon, of course, is this large corporation. Amazon has done what? They actually hired, because of the nature of the working class in the South, like a heavily Black workforce, right? Well, despite the failure of that particular campaign, although I'm deeply impressed with it, it really sort of, I would have been stunned if they had won that union vote. That what they do, you gotta be committed to racial equality. I mean, young people, I appreciate that I'm speaking at a young person, right? Like young people are more committed generally than older generations to equality, racial, sexual, and other, right? So any institution doesn't have demonstrated commitment to that, it's not gonna attract people. Right, like, of course, that's not enough. but that's necessary, right? It's not sufficient, right? Like, and so unions have to sort of be better. I think actually unions are generally progressive. They used to be bad on immigration in the US, but actually in recent years, AFL-CIO is even sort of has a pretty good stand when it comes to undocumented workers, right? Like all of this comes down to whose side are you on and who's the enemy? The enemy is not some Honduran, the enemy is Amazon, right? Like, and so we have to keep that in mind. Teamsters actually could take a page from this and just sort of be better on these matters. It has a history of being very sexist. So like, we want to keep that in mind. I think the uptick in strikes, the Frito-Lay strike, I don't have an opinion about that. I mean, I'm glad that it seems like the workers won some concessions, right? Like, I think that like surveys say, right, like that many people now are more pro-union than they've been in a generation or two. So far, those sort of positive attitudes have not translated into sort of a huge uptick in union membership and union campaigns. That's not entirely surprising, and we'll have to see in the near future. ILW also needs to do better, right? Despite my celebration of it, like it's got some weak links itself, and the W in ILW is warehouse. It used to have a much stronger warehouse division, but companies have shifted, especially years ago, to part-time and temporary workers. Amazon, for instance, in Alabama, it actually didn't do the hiring direct, right? It hires through a subcontractor, right? And then it becomes complicated who to organize. It's easier to replace those workers. Labor law is a huge problem because the laws have been designed to weaken workers and unions. So I don't think we should give up on legislative proposals, the PRO Act being the most obvious, although it seems right now to be dead. My point being that we need government policies that are actually more pro-worker and pro-union, and we have to keep pushing for them, even though that's a tough fight too, right? Like, because in the 1930s, which we go back to as the example, that's when the LW was born, it was only after basically labor laws were created that made it much easier to unionize and strike and forced employers to sort of negotiate. That was necessary also, right? And so as weak as the Biden administration may be, they can be pushed, I think, a bit to sort of essentially level the playing field slightly, although the playing field is so uneven between employers and workers that we need to level it a lot, right? But we have to get started.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that. And then I know that you touched on this a little bit, but something that came up in discussion was sort of if you could provide a little bit of context behind the anti-communist and conservative bends in 20th century unions, and sort of something that's reading about labor history, especially during that time, the sort of anti-communist threads do a great job of dividing unions. And so if you could speak a little bit about that in the context of dock workers.
Of course, very important. Another example of how like we can be weakened, right, through these repressive forces that don't sort of like, that are used very cynically, right, by employers and governmental allies, right? Like, so, I mean, the classic example in this particular industry, right, is like the dock workers in the West Coast broke away from the dock workers in the East Coast. There was actually a union they were a part of, but it was New York based. And that union still exists. It's called the International Longshoremen's Association. They have not degendered their name as the ILW did, right? So that's an example of a difference. Is that a big or a small difference? I'll let people can decide for themselves, right? Like, but you know, the ILA was controlled by more conservative working class people who didn't have a political agenda the way that the West Coast dock workers did. And the West Coast dock workers also sort of bristled at the anti-democratic tendencies that was very top down, which is to say the opposite of rank and file, which is sort of bottom up, right, in terms of who has power, right? And so I'll give you a few examples. The ILA doesn't have at the international level, which is to say really the national level, because they have a little Canada section, but like that's why they call themselves international, right? Like they don't have sort of one person, one votes, right? Like, and so at the local level and at the international level, and this was the case also in Teamsters, right? Like, but also UAW, where members don't directly elect their president, right? Like, in the same way the Electoral College is created as a check on basically citizen voting power, so too in many unions, right? And so there's been pushes and in some cases successes in democratizing the internal structures, right? In the ILWU, for example, they sort of were the heirs to some, because of some wobbly influence, right? In Local 10, you can't be the local president for more than 2 years, then you have to rotate back into the ranks. So you don't have people who are long-term leaders, who may forget what it's like to be an ordinary worker in that field. Right? They also limited the earnings, right? So that local elected leaders and international elected leaders in the ILW don't get paid more than people in the field. Right, like again, to create these divisions between the leaders and the workers. The ILA, actually, that's not the case. Some of the best paid union officials in the country are in this union, the ILA, even though it's a pretty small membership. And they never have had a newspaper. So the ILWU actually published something called the Dispatcher. I actually had images from it in my presentation, because they believe that the members should have some knowledge. And they shared that. And in every issue, the president has a column, right? Like, and so they have a library. I did a lot of my research at that library. It's open to the public. Now, I can't actually look at everything in their archive. They actually have a publicly accessible archive. Very few unions have that. Some unions give their older stuff to libraries, right? Like, and very few companies, right? Like, and so they're not transparent, right? Like, and so if what's the key to democracies? People have to have power of their leaders, but also they have to have access to knowledge, right? Instead of being hidden, right? Ordinary members can actually participate even in union negotiations. They can attend and witness in the LWU, right? Like, and so these are examples of how this left-wing institution, right, actually created internal democratic structures that, although could be better, right, by comparison to many other unions, forgetting about other institutions, because most union institutions are simply undemocratic, right? Like, at work, we don't get to pick our leaders, right? Like, and so, like, that's really important, and that's a contrast, because the ILA has been undemocratic, and therefore it's easy for leaders to become corrupt because there's no way to replace them, right? Like, that's why we have term limits for executive leaders and in public, in government, right? Like, now the anti-communist point, which I haven't come back to, right? Like, that's just a whip used, right, to sort of attack, right? Now we know that, but how do we guard against that, right? Like, the answer is, those of us who are leftist, we need to sort of earn the trust and faith of those who are not, who are the majority, so that they will not basically attack us because they know us, right? And so, it was unfortunate that, like, after World War I, after World War II, right, like, essentially the government attacked the left, and that worked, right? It actually radically weakened labor and other movements, and it resulted in the 20s, for example, like after the first Red Scare, a massive increase in economic inequality, right? Like, because the haves got more, right? Like, so how do we guard against that? That's a tough one. I think we have to be honest. We can't be corrupt, because that'll be used against us, but also in the ILWU, when the Harry Bridges and other leaders were red baited, the rank and file, most of whom were not communists, stood 100% by their leaders because they had earned their trust, right? Like, they knew they were honest, and they believed it was would hurt them too, right? And so, unfortunately, in many other unions and after World War II, the rank and file didn't stand by, right? Or the leaders at the AFL and the CIO level didn't stand by. And why that is, well, that's complicated too, I suppose. But I think the LW is an example, is somewhat exceptional because it had overtly left-wing leaders who the rank and file refused to disassociate from, right? Because he was of them, but also he had proven he had helped them, right? Like, not just by fighting against racism, but actually earning them more money, right? Like, so bread and butter games, right? Like, matter too, right? Like, so those are some musings, I suppose, not really sort of great answers, but maybe decent answers.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. This has been a really great session, I think. I might be just specifically interested in this history. But we are at the hour, so I just want to thank Peter again so much for attending this and teaching us for the past hour and a half. The link to Peter's book is in the chat. And if you would like to check out other lectures from the People's Forum's Histories of the Working Class in North America, you can visit our website, which is peoplesforum.org. And thank you again, Peter, and everybody. I hope everybody has a good night.
Thank you very much, Mia, and everyone else in the People's Forum for their help, and for those who attended. I'm very appreciative of your time. Good night.